Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Lageson, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Please subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPDChina. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is president of the Institute for the American Future, vice chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America on Real America's Voice Network.
Welcome, everyone, to this edition of our Committee on the Present Danger China weekly webinar series focused on threats the Chinese Communist Party poses to our country, in some cases has done for quite some time, and in some cases those that are becoming manifest, at least at the present moment, if not new threat vectors, in their unrestricted warfare against our country, aimed at nothing short of destroying it.
We have found several.
We're going to talk about perhaps the single most dangerous of those threat vectors as we speak, I think, at the minimum. It is one that has been underway for some time. It is one that I personally have been worried about since I was in the Reagan administration, not necessarily from the Chinese Communist Party, but at the time from the Soviet Union, and came to my attention and my responsibilities for nuclear forces and arms control policy that our electric grid and other electronic devices in our country, both military and civilian, could be devastatingly attacked with a phenomenon known as electromagnetic pulse. It was a highly classified subject at the time, and it wasn't until 2004, many years after I left the Pentagon, that it became a subject of public conversation, informed public conversation, thanks to the work of what came to be known as the Congressional Electromagnetic Pulse Task Force, or Congressional Task Force. And it did an extraordinary job, in fact, a series of very important reports about the serious dangers associated with the grid going down. As it happens, that can take place as a result not just of electromagnetic pulse, as you will hear about a bit more from Sam Faddis momentarily, but actually the numerous means by which a determined adversary, perhaps not even one as capable as the Chinese Communist Party and its People's Liberation Army are, to cause chaos, mass destruction, certainly widespread death, simply by turning the lights off in a way that cannot be readily reversed. In the intervening period, I and various groups that I've been associated with, notably the Secure the Grid Coalition and this wonderful Committee on the Present Danger China, have been trying to raise the alarm in the hopes of not terrifying people, but ensuring that the necessary corrective actions that would, as it's said, harden the grid, make it more resilient, were taken. I wish I could report that more progress has been made. For a variety of reasons, which we may get into, there is still a yawning vulnerability to you. One or two of them are relatively new. We look forward to hearing from all of them, starting with Colonel Grant Newsom, a member of our Committee on the Present Danger China, a very familiar contributor to these programs, for which we are very grateful. In addition to a distinguished career of service in the uniform of a United States Marine, he also served as a foreign service officer in our embassy in Tokyo and has been based forward deployed, I like to think, as a businessman in East Asia for many years as well. He is the author of a tremendously important book, When China Attacks, A Warning to America, and a contributor to, as I said, these programs and media outlets across the world. We're delighted to have him with us by videotape on this occasion, and we're going to take stock with him of what are the strategic implications of having, as we were putting it today, the Chinese Communist Party inside our wires. Let's go to the video now.
Sometimes you get asked a question that you really wonder, well, why is anybody even asking this? Why should we even be thinking about it now, given that what we know of the nature of the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Republic of China, and what they intend to do to us? But this is one of those questions. And what is the question, obviously, is the Chinese in our grid, in our strategic infrastructure, the critical infrastructure as well, same thing. But we think about it, go back a little bit, you think about this and how we always consider this issue of our war with the Chinese as something off in the future on the day that the shooting actually starts. And then much of our debate these days is about the woefully inadequate, in fact non-existent almost, say shipbuilding capacity. It's 200 times less than what China has. We don't have enough aircraft. We don't have enough of the right sorts. We can't make enough missiles and ammunition to sustain a fight, much less to help our friends around the world. They talk about, do we have positioning in the Asia Pacific so that we can operate, does the Marine Corps have a proper operating capability with this Force Design 2030? How exactly are we going to fight? Can our allies do it? The Japanese, the Filipinos, the Australians. So we're actually talking about kinetic warfare and what happens then. But the Chinese have always looked at it very differently. And the war has already started, for one thing. And what they have been about is positioning themselves and softening us up so that the day the shooting actually starts, that things are going to happen to us that are going to make it impossible for us to do the kinetic warfare. And so even if we can somehow get our military act together, and our financial act as well, that we're not able to fight or not able to fight very well. And what that means is they've gone after our infrastructure, particularly our grid. And if you think about it, it's not all that hard to figure out. Think about what happens when the electricity goes down, and every now and then a huge storm plows through Washington, and trees fall on power lines, and suddenly half the people of Washington have no electricity. And think about that, just what an inconvenience it is. People tend to fret and go frantic, I think even without a storm, say when you don't have 15 minutes of Wi-Fi. Just think of your reaction to that. But imagine, though, if, for example, the grid goes down, we don't have electricity. Well, how are you going to move forces around? How are your troops even going to get the base so they can deploy? How are they going to operate when their families, are trying to deal with lack of electricity? And if you don't have electricity, you don't have a lot of other things. You don't have water, for example. You don't have food, but partly because you can't grow it very well, you can't transport it. Just think about those things. Our transport networks are just completely shot. You don't just get in the car, go to the gas station, fill up, and go somewhere. You can't do all of those things. And that's what we're going to face when the Chinese decide it is time to pull the trigger. And why can they pull the trigger and have something actually go off? It's because they've had decades to install their equipment, their hardware, their software into our systems that, as I say, give them that really two hands on our throat, ready to apply pressure at the time. And this has been going on, as I said, for decades. I remember that at least in 2013, that the U.S. government actually issued an official report on this. and was saying that the Chinese have been, or they didn't say Chinese because we couldn't say Chinese at the time, but it was obvious who they meant. They were talking about how they have gotten into our infrastructure, our hardware, and local utilities all over the place. And they specifically said, you know, this is not just for to see if they can do it. It's not a reconnaissance, but rather it is getting themselves in position. And think of how long they've been doing that and how widespread it is now and all the opportunities. And think about also the thinking back then. Back then you had every U.S. business that could was buying and sourcing things from China, you know, chips, generators, exchangers, everything that you could possibly have because it was cheap. And this was considered, the smart kids all thought this was really the epitome of brilliance because they were getting a slightly better return on investment. Share prices were up, and as a result, they were going to get good bonuses. So it really is our ruling class that sold us out, that put us into this position. And anybody, remember that, anybody who talked about China being a threat, and it included not just a military threat, but an economic threat, we should not have them. So if somebody we're dealing with, they should not be in our infrastructure. But nobody was listened to, although there were people sounding the alarm. The government side of things, was it any better? You know, you'll recall that, you know, Kurt Campbell, for example, always a prominent figure in China relations, would always refer to the Chinese as my friends, the Chinese. And that was very much the thinking. It wasn't just him. It was a situation where you could not say anything about the Chinese that was scary or not. So we've gotten ourselves into this mess when if it comes time to actually fight the Chinese, they could make it almost impossible for us to respond. And yes, we might adjust, we might come up with workarounds, we might recover. But think about it, you've got a shooting war going on in Asia, say, against Taiwan, and it only requires the Chinese to have a short break for where we're not really available to respond forcefully, and we're not distracted. And they just need a certain amount of time really to be able to create a fait accompli against Taiwan. And that is all the time you need if you can turn the lights out, turn the power off in the United States, and create that kind of chaos. So an administration has to deal with that, and it cannot give anywhere near full attention to what's going on in the Western Pacific, and the mechanics, the physics of actually getting your forces out into the region are simply impossible. And then you combine that with fifth column activities inside the United States that we've talked about many times on these webinars. And how exactly are you going to fight the Chinese in the western side of the Pacific, in East Asia? Well, that isn't going to happen. And now you ask, or it's not going to happen very well, and probably not probably not going to prevail. So looking at all of this now, you have to ask yourself, well, where's the urgency? Where's the sense of urgency at the national level or even the local level to correcting this, to fixing these things, to doing things like replacing the cranes, or at least the software in the cranes that operate most of America's ports. The cranes come from China, and you know that when the time comes, these are not going to work. Well, that makes it even harder to get the fleet out into the Pacific, harder to get the Marines out of Camp Pendleton, the Army as well, the Air Force, assuming they've got aircraft left after the mysterious drone attacks on day one or a few days before. It's how are we actually going to fight a war? So where's the urgency? You don't see it, but we've got to wake up quickly. Certainly there are plenty of people on Capitol Hill who understand this. I think that the business class does not. Wall Street certainly does not. When Bank of America and JP Morgan apparently are all in on a Chinese battery maker that provides technology and hardware to the Chinese Navy that will kill Americans. When those luminaries are all in, say we are in a very serious position, and to put it mildly, The Chinese must love it. Just think about what we would think if we could do all those things to them. We would be breathing a lot easier. Can we do all those things? You like to think so, but I don't know. I wonder. So ultimately, when I talk about all of this, besides, just not being miffed, but, wishing I didn't have to explain it. And I think this audience gets it, but most people do not. I'm reminded of an email I got from a young Marine officer from Afghanistan. And in it, he wrote, "Sir, sometimes I think we want to lose." And unfortunately, I think he was right. I think there's plenty of us who don't want to lose, but our ruling class, they've got their work cut out for us, and we'll see how this goes. But thank you very much for having me on.
Well, thank you. As always, an extremely astute analysis of the situation, and I think the strategic implications of what we're talking about are now very retired Central Intelligence Agency clandestine service officer with over 20 years experience out in the cold, as they say. He has also served in a variety of other capacities. He's an author, notably of Beyond Repair, The Decline and Fall of the CIA, and now the editor of a marvelous online resource, which I strongly commend to you all, and magazine.substack.com. We asked Sam Faddis to talk about, both the character of the efforts the Chinese have been making to embed what might be called Trojan horses in our electric grid, what Donald Trump did during his first time to try to stem that practice, what Joe Biden did right out of the gate to reverse Mr. Trump's directive, and what we should make of all of this. Very important, I think, complement to what we just heard from Colonel Newsham. Let's go to a videotape with Sam Faddis from our friend Steve Bannon's program. You'll see his marvelous wingman, I guess you might call her, Natalie Winters, who conducted an interview earlier this week for the War Room show with our friend Sam, and with permission, we're using their highlights of some of that conversation.
We have found several different types of devices in equipment connected to solar farms in the United States, the equipment being manufactured in China. So either in the batteries or in inverters, other components. They have no legitimate purpose. Let's just boil it down to what it is. Why are they there? They're there so that the Chinese can remotely kill these solar farms and shut down the power coming from them. That's the only reason. That's explicitly what it is. So they are in advance pre-positioning the gear to let them shut this down. And this is, frankly, completely consistent with what we have seen from them as they have done this all across the power grid year after year after year. It's also consistent with the hacking that of critical infrastructure. There's only for one purpose. It isn't to gather data or spy on you. It is so they can turn out the lights and everything else that requires electricity in the United States when they choose to. We're not going to keep doing this. One of the very first things Joe Biden did when he sat down in the White House was lift that ban and begin the reinstallation of these sabotage transformers. There are now something like 500 of them. By the way, they're custom made. If the Chinese take one out, it could take you 5 years to order a new one, and I think we could guess if they're the ones that crash the grid, they're not sending you a new one anyway. But to get it from anywhere, it will take years. People need to understand that. It's not about they're turning off the lights and maybe it's a couple of days and then everything's back to normal. They're turning off the lights and the lights aren't coming back on for the foreseeable future. So I always tell people, imagine you're sitting in your house, you got no lights, you got no internet. That means you got no money, you got no banking.
And what's your take on the, I would say, likelihood of these being used?
Yeah, well, the short answer to that is we don't know, but then we haven't really been looking very hard, right? We've been doing the exact opposite. I mean, I keep coming back to this point because I want folks to absorb it. We're not talking about cyber attacks that are going to steal your data and take your social security number. We're talking about cyber attacks which will destroy your entire modern way of life. And again, destroy, not temporarily interrupt, like the power will be off for 24 hours and you'll burn some candles. Like, it's not coming back up. You're now in the 1600s. And this is fact. Back almost 20 years ago now, we did a test. We, the U.S. government, took one of these large transformers, set it up, I think, at the Idaho National Lab, hacked it, and physically destroyed it. You can watch that. It's called the Aurora test, and you can look at it online, see a video of it. By that, I mean, in about 3 minutes' time, the thing is belching smoke and on fire. So you're not going to call the repair guy and put it back together, and it isn't working anymore. So your power's not coming back up at all. They have made vast gains in the 20 years since, almost 20 years since. So that isn't to inconvenience you. Again, it's not to steal your data. It's to put the whole United States back in a pre-industrial state and win a war. And they are perilously close to being able to do it right now. Yes.
How ready and prepped do you think the United States is for attacks like these?
Not at all. I mean, you've referenced EMP, an electromagnetic pulse, which essentially a nuclear device detonated at a certain altitude produces a pulse and it'll fry all the electronics. Okay, we have done essentially nothing. So again, I keep coming back to this because it's critical. When I say fry your electronics, I mean fry your electronics. Your car is electronic, your computer, your television. You're not going to put a new widget in it. It doesn't work anymore, and it never will work again. Now apply that to every electronic device in the entire United States, from the banking system to aircraft to everything else. We know how to harden our systems against it. We aren't physically doing it.
So there you have it, folks. We have seen the enemy, and they are us, as I think Pogo famously said. We are owning, for some considerable extent of this problem, the responsibility for it having not only been allowed in the first instance, but to persist. To get a fuller understanding of the extent of this vulnerability, we are very pleased to have with us another great friend of our Committee on the Present Danger China and contributor to these programs from time to time, Dave Walsh. He is one of our go-to guys on all things energy related, having been a senior executive in places like Westinghouse and Mitsubishi Power. These days he's with the Dakota Group, LLC, and he has been assessing the implications of this so-called Green New Deal for quite some time. And as we see it, what today's topic is meant to address is both that, the contribution it's made to the weakening of our critical infrastructure, particularly baseload power production and distribution, as well as what these pieces of Chinese gear now inside our wires poses as a mortal threat to the grid and to the American people as a result. And not least, we've asked Dave to give us some suggestions as to what, at this late hour, to be sure, we must do about these problems. Dave, welcome back. It's so good to have you. The floor is yours, sir.
Frank, thanks for having me. The degree to which they've intervened into the U.S. power generation system is, in a short time, is remarkable. In the time period 2020 to this year's over for new capacity installation 2025, so a 6-year period, 91% of new power generation devices installed in this country have been intermittent, part-time, non-dispatchable devices, being solar, battery storage in the main, and still some wind. But mainly about 70%, 72% of all what's been installed has been solar and battery storage. with only 9% being baseload continuous duty plant Vogtle, the only nuclear plant, and a very few combined cycles being built, baseload continuous duty plants. China controls the supply chain of 86% of all thin film PV for solar, and about 87% of all of the battery storage technology. So essentially, 72% of all this new equipment installed has been Chinese solar cells and battery storage in the last 6 years. And the coming 10 years, for example, the Florida plant involves over the next 10 years, 91% of new generation capacity installed here will be solar and battery storage. Texas, ERCOT, the next 5 years, 91% of all new capacity installed will be solar cells. No longer so much wind, solar, and battery storage, even in ERCOT, after all the reliability problems that have become so well known in Texas. So their intervention in the U.S. supply chain of on-the-ground installed assets for electric power generation has been enormous, and it continues. It's been so important that the beautiful big new bill involves, and as of last night, we had some headway in this, getting in the way of stopping this mass importation of electric generation technology solely from China in solar and battery storage. So we've got, looks like a 1 year time period of transition where we can get back to building some baseload continuous duty plants if the bill holds, creating a kibosh against further incentivization of this, which we're actually, we suspended the tariffs on it about 3 weeks ago. And unless this change had occurred last night, we'd still be incenting this for the next 3 to 4 years. And that is the importation of solar and battery storage as by far the #1 power generation technology in the country. And this has had a devastating consequence on what is known as reserve margins, electricity reserve margins. That is to have a sustainable, robust grid that operates full-time, uninterruptibly, and reliably. In the past, the target's been and has been achieved about 23.5% reserve margin, extra power capacity to be generated on the coldest days, the hottest days, and in emergencies. Those reserve margins have declined. In 2012, what was 23.5%, 24%, dropped in the last 10 years by about a full 41%. We're down to now 14.9% official reserve margins in the country for electricity. We had been at 25%. That's because so much baseload coal, nuclear technology has been shut down in exchange for installing all this part-time intermittent wind and now much more solar and battery storage. If you look at the reserve margins on an actual basis, calculated apples to apples with 10 years ago, we're really at about 13%. Once you get below 15% in reserve margins, you're accelerating with every percentage point of reserve margin decline, you're accelerating the probability of brownouts and blackouts by a factor of 7 times more likely for every percentage point below 15% reserve margins we get. China knows this. They know this. They know the destabilizing impact of having all this very part-time intermittent technology on our system supplied by them. And now we're learning rapidly to what degree this system has been invaded with sensors that can kill switches, that the inverters specifically that are there to convert DC power to efficient, usable AC power, and also as control devices, the inverters can be used to basically shut down the system to the extent they've supplied it. This may be what happened in Spain when Spain lost 15,000 megawatts of power all of a sudden in a few minutes about 3 weeks ago on a Monday. They're now claiming they still don't know the why of this, examining now millions of data points. It is well possible this was a test of principle and this working by China, because again, in Western Europe, the same thing. 87% of the solar cells and batteries for battery storage there also come from China and appear to be heavily infiltrated with sensors. So it's possible, it hasn't been concluded conclusively yet, but possible that whole outage impacting 60 million people across all of Spain, part of southern France, and all the way to Belgium, 60 million people impacted for 13 hours may have been triggered by these devices, because the same impact there, 87% of this equipment in Western Europe has come from China. So we've got to get in front of these incentives. no longer incentivizing this, get the tariffs back in place to get some momentum going forward, to build some base load combined cycle power plants in this country, build some supercritical coal plants, and get back on board with continuous duty, non-Chinese made basic power plants. So that's the only way forward to get around this. And then examine all this equipment in detail in the field. Because as you said, in transformers, this was proven out about 8 years ago that a couple of units were infected with these. And those were the only units studied. It had sensors in them that were basically kill switches. So we now know that we have this in the solar farms and the inverters that control them. It's a disaster.
Indeed. Thank you, Dave Walsh. And we'll come back to you in Q&A on some of the things that need to be done now, particularly. But before we do, I want to bring in another contributor, first time, I believe, to these programs. A man recommended to us by Dave Walsh and based in part on their shared experience at a marvelous program. Our friend, former Congressman Dave Bratt, has organized now for several years running a CEO summit down at Liberty University, in which they appeared in at least one and maybe two occasions recently. Dick Storm is an engineer by training, a contributing editor to Power Magazine, a continuing instructor of a short course on electric utility management, formerly a power generation consultant with the Aluminum Company of America, better known as Alcoa. He has a blog called the Dick Storm Pro Biz blog. I commend that to you. And we've asked him to address the topic. I think I've coined a phrase in framing it this way. How did the CCP get inside our grid? The CCP's old friends, as they call them, the red-green New Deal, and the challenge of our time. Dick, welcome. It's good to have you with us, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's my honor to be here. I have been concerned about the destruction of dispatchable, reliable, affordable coal power generation. I was offended personally back in the 90s when Bill Clinton was president and New Source Review was invented by Joe Goffman and the people at the EPA. My tasks on power plants back then was to improve efficiency, improve capacity. And when we did those things, a lot of times the power companies were sued, and then they would settle in court, and then they would shut the coal plants down. And it was then that I started paying attention. I'm just basically a nuts and bolts power generation guy, not a policy wonk. So as Obama became president and Gina McCarthy became the head of the EPA, the endangerment finding and the war on coal really hit its stride. And between 2010 and now, we have shut down about half of the reliable coal power generation that America has. Over 125,000 megawatts of coal plants have been shut down. We have not replaced them, not built a new coal plant since 2013. And as Dave had pointed out, there's solar and there's wind, but they're intermittent. And we're not going to have a problem now, like in May or March or April or September or October. The problem is going to be in July and August, in the very, very hot months, and in December, January, February, in the very, very cold months. And that, tell you the truth, January 15th of this year, I thought what Sam Faddis was talking about was going to happen before President Trump was inaugurated. Because in the cold weather months, we depend on about 80% coal, nuclear, and gas. And solar and wind just do not perform on hot summer nights or on cold winter days, and solar collectors are useless when they have snow covering them. So anyway, the problem we're going to have with the Chinese, I predict, and they know this, is at peak generating periods. So we have shut down lots of power plants, over half of the coal plants, even some nuclear units got shut down because of the ridiculous climate policies of the Biden administration. And of course, they really started with Bill Clinton and the Democrats, and then with Obama, they went on steroids. And now we have irreversibly demolished. Now, not only were the power plants shut down, but the supply chain to build new power plants, to make high-pressure tubing, to make high-grade stainless steel tubing, to make the generators, to make the steam generators, the feed water heaters, and all the auxiliaries, has also, much of it been lost. One company that I was familiar with, I know Dave's familiar with, is Foster Wheeler. They went all in on China back 15, 20 years ago. They moved their manufacturing from Mountaintop, Pennsylvania to China. And now Foster Wheeler's they're not involved any at all. One of the most magnificent manufacturing facilities that we had in America was the Combustion Engineering Chattanooga Works, which had about 88 acres of high-class manufacturing, including 15,000-ton presses to make nuclear reactor vessels, pressing up to 12-inch thick sheet and electroslag welding of these together. That is all gone. We cannot build pressure parts like that in America. I think Babcock and Wilcox still can do some, but back in the 70s, combustion engineering itself had about 25,000 megawatts of new capacity, manufacturing capacity that they could have done. Now, combustion engineering was folded into Alstom, Alstom folded into General Electric, and I live in Hilton Head, and I've got a couple friends that retired from Alstom, and they just chuckle. If General Electric was given a purchase order to build a couple 600 megawatt coal plants, they don't have the people to do it anymore. So the supply chain has been severed. I was looking in the news yesterday, and I see that ICF, a consulting firm, highly respected, they came, the NERC has their forecast, the National Electric Manufacturers Association have their forecast, and they are up in the range of needing 125,000 megawatts of new generation by 2030, and 50% of what we have now by 2050. That would be 600,000 megawatts. And supply chains harmed. So May 20th, ICF comes out with another one. They had the advantage of looking at the other people's forecast. They say by 2030, we'll have a 25% increase, almost 250,000 megawatts. And by 2050, they say an increase of 78%, not 50%. So as these AI centers are being built and creating more and more demand on a 24/7, 365-day-a-year basis, they're drawing from the grid. And when we get to peak summer periods and peak winter periods, the grid is going to be stressed. In fact, even the wonderful top of the tier, Duke Energy, had rolling blackouts a couple years ago on Christmas Eve because they just didn't have enough power. They planned on buying power from PJM. People at PJM couldn't provide it, so they had rolling blackouts. We're getting to the point where we're going to have rolling blackouts. Where I sit in South Carolina, the provider of electricity here is Santee Cooper. a state-owned utility. It's 88% coal-fired. Our legislature had put pressure on Santee Cooper to exit coal by 2035. My state senator tells me, he says, "Oh, Dick, don't worry. We're not going to shut those coal plants down until we have some replacements." Well, that's fine to say that, easy to say those words, but the supply chain for new superheaters, new reheaters, planned maintenance like we used to do in outage season is not being done. And these pieces of equipment are being demanded to run at full output when we get to these peak periods. So each year, as we get more and more electric growth, and the experts that are into forecasting are talking like 5% a year or so, when it comes, and when, as Dave mentioned, you have minimum reserves, the only thing that can happen is blackouts. And then, as Sam Feta said, and as I've read in the Wall Street Journal and a bunch of other respected news outlets, there are major transformers. I'm not talking small inverters for 3 megawatts or 5 megawatts of solar. I'm talking 500 megawatt main bank transformers that take 4 to 6 years from the time they're ordered till the time that they show up on site, as having kill switches in them. And one of them was sent from Houston to Sandia National Laboratories. And I'm not sure, maybe you guys have seen reports. But all I know is it was intercepted at the Port of Houston and sent to Sandia Labs to do investigation. So what they've done is they've done a multifaceted weakening of America. They did some very, very effective footwork up front with the climate policies that Mr. Biden made those the number one priority of his administration. Obama before him made it a pretty big part of his policy. We've got the culture in Hollywood, TV, education, non-governmental organizations like the Sierra Club and the NRDC. Some of these people that are influencing are the same people that end up as being administrators in the EPA. And virtually all of the Democrat Party, and we've got people like Ed Markey and John Podesta, Obama, Jennifer Granholm, AOC, John Kerry, Michael Reagan, Joe Goffman, Deb Haaland. These people, they're just in the tank for strengthening China and weakening America. And as I see it, and the reason I accepted so quickly to come to be with you is, if President Trump said, "I want you to build 10 coal plants right now," it would be very difficult to do so. We need 50 or 100. We shut down 125 or 150 of them in the last 15 years. They should be replaced.
Thank you very much. And I know we're going to have to let you go early, so let me put a question or two to you first, if I may. You mentioned towards the end there the extent to which this agenda, the Green New Deal, as it was called by AOC, the sustainable energy, sort of program, particularly enabled by this so-called Inflation Reduction Act, has an agenda. And I think you put it very starkly, weakening America and strengthening China. Whether that is explicitly the purpose or whether that is just the predictable effect, I guess we could debate. But could you talk a little bit more about some of those that you have been tracking who have been particularly aggressively pursuing this, and what we can tell about their interest in this, given other aspects of their agendas?
Probably seen Charlie Reese's last column, the Orlando Sentinel fellow that wrote the editorial about 20 years ago, 545 versus 300 million. And he talked about how things that get done in policies are done by 500 525 congressmen, the Supreme Court, and the president to come up with the 545 people. The influence of China to the Democrat Party through NGOs is hard to trace. There's a book that Capital Research did, Scott Walter, called Arabella. And he tried to follow the money trail to the Sierra Club, to the Natural Resources Defense Council, the Environmental Defense Fund, and outfits like that. And it gets really hard to trace down the 501c3 1099 forms of what they pay. One that was exposed was Gina McCarthy worked for the Natural Resources Defense Council. She didn't work for the NRDC. She worked for the NRDC Action Fund. And in that, she was paid, as I recall, $855,000. And that was, I think, either before Obama or between Obama and Trump. And anyway, these people go like musical chairs from the NRDC to the EPA, and then they come up with the endangerment finding of CO2. And it's basically trying to disable the manufacturing and electric production capacity of America by policy changes. And they're long-term. And once they kill the manufacturing supply chain, it is going to be, like Sam Finnis said, it's going to be really hard to recover from a major blackout. And one other thing, 60 Minutes, I'm not a big fan of 60 Minutes, but they had John Wellinghoff, an ex-FERC commissioner, a couple years ago. And he said on 60 Minutes on TV, he said, 9 major transformers in North America could put us in a blackout. He said that right on 60 Minutes. You can find it on YouTube. And I don't think it would be quite that easy today. I'd like to think that the power companies have done better. But everything we've done in policy, when I was a startup engineer in the 70s for Carolina Power and Light, it was a regional utility. Philadelphia Electric was a regional utility. Georgia Power, regional utility. South Carolina Electric and Gas. Each one of those utilities would build new plants and would plan for 25% reserves. And in North Carolina in the 70s, electricity growth was about 10% a year. They were building a new power plant every 2 years. It was a 200 megawatt power plant. It was a 400, next one 400, next one 720, the one I was a startup engineer on. And everybody in the utilities, Virginia Electric and Power to the north, Philadelphia Electric, Pepco, everybody did their own planning for the future. When this is not the Chinese problem, this we did to ourselves. What we did was we got rid of integrated utilities. Now we have people, generators in South Carolina and at Duke Energy and Philadelphia Electric, now is part of Exelon. They sell the power onto RTOs, regional transmission operators like PJM or Southern Company, MISO in the Midwest, ERCOT in Texas. Nobody is planning ahead. I see right here, the integrated IRP for planning for a future generation for South Carolina. They say, well, we're going to buy power in the future from North Carolina and from Georgia when we shut down the coal plants. Well, you look at the IRPs for Duke Energy and for Georgia Power just changed theirs and said we're not going to shut coal down after all because, hey, we can't make enough power. But anyway, the neighbors are doing the same thing. And earlier I had said we have not built a new coal plant since 2013. So, and as Dave said, 90% of the new capacity is solar and wind, which is intermittent. It doesn't work on the day that you have a a polar vortex or a snowstorm or unseasonable hot weather in August. So everybody in the utilities are dependent on their neighbor, and the big brains in Washington say what we need is more transmission lines so we can share the power. The sun's always going to be shining someplace and the wind's always going to be blowing someplace. So just connect the utilities together and it'll all be okay. Well, now we're back to those transformers, and they're very vulnerable. So the way I see it, it's self-sabotaging. It is some of the most serious self-harm that I ever saw an industry or a country do. And it to me, it is just so obvious. And the people that are employed in the power companies are so interested in regular dividends that they cut these deals to cut their carbon, and they get bonuses based on the carbon reductions of their portfolio and generation. You have these people like in Xcel Energy up in Minnesota talking about replacing the Sherburne County coal plant with solar collectors. I said, come on, I worked at that plant. I've been to Minnesota in the winter. It snows, it's cold, and they're going to replace a 2,700 megawatt magnificent coal plant with solar panels. And I mean, you can't make this stuff up.
Solar panels, which, as you said, I think don't work when they're covered with snow. And there is snow in Minnesota, of course, as you've indicated. One more question for you, if I may, Dick. Your testimony about the dismantling of our domestic manufacturing, our supply chains, is very alarming. I guess Babcock and Wilcox is still a going concern because it's got Navy production. Perhaps we'll turn that over to the Chinese too. What do you think?
Oh, and actually, a friend of mine from B&W, after I did all this advocating, and said, you know, we need to build some more plants like Turk in Arkansas, 600 megawatt, ultra super critical. So I send an email to my friend and says, hey, if you guys got a purchase order to make a new plant like Turk, could you do it? Well, he emailed me. Well, he didn't email me right back. It took a day. He did some checking, and he emailed me back and he said, yeah, we could do that. Well, we're talking one. Well, when they demolish these and implode them, it takes about 10 seconds to demolish a 600 megawatt coal plant, but it takes about 4 years to build one. Well, it used to take 4 years. It might take 10 years now, but B&W is still going. They got very, very weakened by asbestos lawsuits, self-imposed policies of Democrat lawyers, the tort lawyers that sued the company and went into bankruptcy in the 80s. They reemerged a smaller company, split into B&W Conventional and BWX, which is the nuclear side. And the nuclear side in Mount Vernon, Indiana is still going, and they have some facilities in Canada that are still going. But nothing like what combustion engineering had in Chattanooga, nothing like what B&W had in Barberton, Ohio back in 1975.
Well, Dick Storm, thank you very much for your contributions to this program. I hope you'll come back with updates as we work our way through what must be done about all of this to right the ship. But again, your expertise and lifetime of service in this space is deeply appreciated, sir.
Thank you.
Yep. Let me come to Dave Walsh. I'm unfailingly impressed by the efforts that you've been making here and many, many other places as well, of course, to provide the average American some sense of what it means that we are not taking this prodigiously important, national responsibility seriously. The kinds of indulgence that we've engaged in when it comes to these solar and wind and battery operations that are only available some of the time. And the documentation that you, and Dick for that matter, have provided in terms of the dismantling of the baseload power part of the grid is, I think, of incalculable importance, Dave. And I want to give you a chance to both elaborate a little bit further on the economic factors that are at work now, in particular, thanks to these subsidies. Something you touched on, the congressional support for this subsidizing of inadequate production of energy, and notably among some top Republicans in the United States Senate. And if you could, as well, give us some thoughts as to how do we balance, or if you will, right the ship going forward.
The policies that have pushed this along and hijacked our capitalist, way of doing business in this country have been the incentives, incentivizing this fairly old technology. I mean, solar power and wind power particularly are older, mature technologies. Incentivizing them is not making them more modern or more robust or more resilient. These are old technologies. They're known to work a very limited time period. Solar, on average in the U.S., about 4.8 hours a day. Onshore wind, about 7.5 hours a day. The day is 24 hours. You need to create electricity and electrons 24 hours a day. It dissipates immediately. It's not stored up in the wires or saved in a load bank. So these incentives have created this massively artificial market that developers and many utilities have now followed and glommed onto, and whom are large donors into PACs and support political candidates aggressively, such as here in Florida. Florida Power and Light is a major controller of the state house, the state senate, and the governor, and push forward plans that are all about solarization, which create asset churn and the ability to overinvest in capex, because this stuff is enormously expensive for how little power it creates a bonanza for them, but also for in non-regulated arenas, such as the one Dick mentioned well, PJM, MISO, ERCOT. These are all markets where generation has been disaggregated from the distribution. Distribution of electricity is still regulated in those regions. Power generation is not regulated. So you have this queue that forms of potential investors coming in to build power plants. It is not planned. It is not thought through strategically. It's a function of market dynamics and those investors in those kind of facilities, solar and wind, being developers who bid based on incentives and take advantage of incentives that are as high as 55% when you take into account the PTC, the ITC in the Green New Deal, along with the makers, accelerated depreciation. You've got incentive structures that are as high as 55% on wind, solar, and battery storage, creating an artificial demand for this stuff that winds up shuttering baseload coal and nuclear, underbuilding combined cycle based continuous duty plants, and having electricity shortage. Like I mentioned, the last 6 years, what's been built the last 6 years has added a net energy basis to the country of 0.4%. Because the deficiency of all this solar and wind in operating time, the capacity factor of that is so low in hours per day. So when you build 230 gigawatts of it, that really amounts to about 60 on a net basis, accounting for night and lack of wind and sun, and then compound that with all the 40,000 or so megawatts of coal plants you've just shut, additional ones in the last 6 years, we've only added 0.4% to actual energy production from electricity in the last 6 years, where demand is suddenly now spiking again, 2.5% to 3% per year due to server centers, AI, data centers, attempts at reshoring manufacturing, and population growth as well, where electrification is back on stream, growing 2.5% to 3% per year in demand. But we've not grown the supply of electricity through this very part-time technology. This has been a complete disaster for nation in terms of any recovery of industrial policy. And have gone through the roof.
Again, just to come back to this point, several of you have spoken about, I guess the vernacular way I would describe it is, it's no accident, comrade. We're seeing the Chinese being a massive beneficiary of the deindustrialization here, and specifically this artificially stimulated demand for their so-called green technologies. But creating this kind of weakening, to say the least, of our electric grid, our critical infrastructures, to say nothing of their clear success in insinuating their technologies, including those transformers, of course, inside the grid. If you were writing a script for the takedown of America in the hands of a hostile power, which notably, by the way, has a historic admiration for winning without fighting.
Right.
This is pretty much what it would look like, isn't it?
Great example in Spain, Belgium, and France, southern France, of something that is highly likely to happen here as well. If these outages that were 13 hours in duration were impacted by sensors that shut their system down, we are badly, badly exposed to the same thing happening here. Let's not let this good crisis go to waste. We've got to stop importing this kind of equipment, of course, because of the sensor capacity that can be installed in it to cut it off from working. As we become more dependent on it, that becomes a much larger disaster, but because of its cost basis as well. This version of part-time intermittent electricity is 6 to 7 times more costly because the capital spending that's so high lands in utility rates, displacing American gas and coal, that wind up driving electricity prices. And this is the cause, the primary cause here in Florida. Electrification costs are up 42% in the last 6 years. Across the country, they're up 38% in the last 5 years, the cost of electricity, because of the mass adoption of this stuff, which on a per kilowatt hour basis is so expensive. That's another debilitating fact of this. We can't get a hold of inflation unless we stop the energy cost impact of the inflation index caused by this very, very, very expensive stuff that displaces American fuel with the amortization inside the rates of the depreciation of the 5 to 6 times more expensive devices that operate such a short time period per day. It's killing us economically, not to mention, of course, the risk, the military risk.
You and others have mentioned, in addition to solar and wind, batteries. You also suggested a moment ago that, these things can't store electricity in the wires, but you can store them in batteries. The batteries are made in China too, notably, as Sam Faddis, I think it was, or Grant Newsom rather, alluded to, by this company CATL. Our Committee on the Present Danger of China has been doing everything we can think of to raise an alarm about the fact that Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan and Brian Moynihan of Bank of America have just raised $4.4 billion on the international market, including from Americans, in a fundraiser for this company, CATL. Among other things, a Chinese military company, a company that exploits slave labor, and a company that is actually helping the PLA get ready to kill Americans. This is the kind of thing that I am convinced is going to prompt Americans to recoil in horror. But talk a little bit about these batteries and how they fit into this scheme. Is that a panacea to the inadequacies in terms of the full 24-hour cycle of solar and wind?
Yeah, the notionality of battery storage has been invented to offset the horrendous part-time intermittent power supply coming from, in Florida, for example, solar is the 23% capacity factor. That means 77% of the time it doesn't make electricity. So therefore, when you go,
Florida,
In Florida.
A sunny place the last time I checked.
Sunny place, because in midsummer it's cloudy at 1 o'clock here half the time, and it rains very hard. And we have that phenomenon, like everywhere else, known as night. There's no solar power. Night. So if you're in love with that as your primary energy supply, you're going to need scads of batteries in the background to back that up, because you don't have enough electricity to begin with. Right. Well, the fact of the matter is battery storage, according to the EIA itself, is 11 times more costly than building conventional power plants of the type Dick was describing, combined cycle plants, coal plants. 11 times more costly. Battery storage is nowheresville right now in terms of backing up all the wind and solar. Probably about 3% of wind and solar are actually today backed up by batteries, because the supply of batteries is consumed largely by EVs. That's where the Chinese make more money, smaller batteries than utility scale batteries in EVs. The cobalt, the lithium, the copper doesn't exist yet at scale in mining space and processing space to make enough batteries to do mass scale utility storage. So it's theoretically possible, but if a hedge fund or developer wants to make 5 times the profitability than on through utilities, you want this stuff, because it's very, very costly for ratepayers. And the maker of it makes a lot of money. But the electrification basis is awful in total cost for ratepayers and for industry that would depend on that.
Right.
It costs 11 times more costly than combined cycle or coal power. It's absurd. It's an absurd
whether
case.
It's ratepayers or taxpayers, it's somebody else's money that's going
That's
into
right.
this.
Yeah.
And then ratepayers are paying more for the privilege of having this expensive electricity. So.
Yeah. And one of the complexities you have is Elon Musk's company, Tesla, is a major producer of utility scale battery storage. So why he likes solar so much? Guess what? That drives the market for battery storage. Yeah. And this is one of the challenges we face in thinking through this objectively for people, for ratepayers, and for industry, not just his needs to make money. Right. You got to balance that.
You touched there a moment ago on some of the components. Could you speak to the question of whether, at the end of the day, all of these alternative technologies, particularly manufactured in China, which, as we all know, has very little use for environmental policies. How green, in point of fact, are these things relative to these other means of producing energy, but just maybe in absolute terms as well?
Huge billions and billions and billions have been invested by Foster Wheeler, by GE, by Siemens, by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, by Hitachi in cleaning up coal. Coal, the primary pollutants coming out of coal, sulfur, heavy metals, heavy particulate, NOx, nitrous oxide, diminished by 85 to 86% via enormous technical effort by companies making that equipment, scrubbers, FGD equipment, baghouses, electrostatic precipitators. On gas turbines, nitrous oxides have been reduced by about 90% via billions being invested by the 3 major OEMs of those, and basically cleaned up. Now, once CO2 was decided to be named, as Dick mentioned, a greenhouse gas, then we get into chasing a ghost that cannot be caught. Because, globally still, with all the effort and all the billions and billions and hundreds of billions spent on solar and wind, we still produce globally 97% of our energy comes from coal, gas, oil, and nuclear power. Renewables, a very tiny fraction of what's produced globally because of the very part-time nature of these things. And then looking at the CO2 topic, there tends to be a huge dissent in science that CO2 actually has a direct line with growing temperatures or oscillating climate. That is not a case that's proven. In fact, Zeldin's EPA has engaged some of our most notorious scientists, Dick Lindzen, Bill Happer, and others, to begin to reinvestigate any causality or any correlation between warming and CO2. There appears to be a very limited case that that's actually the case. Mm-hmm. So we'll see how that comes out. But there's nothing going on to limit, especially in the third world and developing world, the aggressive use to elevate economic status of coal, oil, and gas for primary power generation. It's only happening here in the highly developed West.
Yeah, with more money than sense, it turns out.
Yeah.
And how about, I've heard statistics, and you've got a wonderful head for them, I don't so much, but that to create a single, relatively small battery for an electric vehicle requires something on the order of, memory serves, 500 tons of raw material, that has to be extracted in terms of rare earth minerals and the like. Is that possible? And how on earth can that be sustainable?
Now, fortunately, EV growth has leveled off somewhat in the last 2 years, but basically that's the correct number. For one car battery, you're talking 500,000 tons of 500 tons of cobalt, of copper metal, and other lithium, particularly for then to be processed with water, create tremendous amount of discharge into the effluent into the wastewater system of processed mined earth material to produce one car battery. No, it's sinfully polluting. And if people here don't like mining, and they don't, the left can't stand mining, but are always very happy. Even this week on Yahoo, major advertisement praising the new copper mine in South America. Those folks don't want that here. They don't want any copper mining here. They don't want any lithium mining going on here. As long as it's in the third world, the left seems to be very happy with the exploitation of poorer nations in the third world to mine these materials in mass bulk and in a very primitive way and in very low wage basis, and often using slave labor in Western China and in Africa to harvest these materials and extract them from the earth, where in Western Europe and North America, mining is, no, we don't do mining anymore, but we certainly use the products from it, and we can't wait to damage the environment globally. No, the resource extraction on battery making is enormous. It's enormous. And then the pollution caused by the refining of lithium into battery grade material. It's enormous. It's an enormous mess, but it's in grossly short supply. There isn't enough of those materials that are on the radar screen to be mined to electrify the world. And China, by the way, are building 400 coal plants as we speak. They know better. This isn't going to work for them. They manufacture batteries. They manufacture solar panels for the rest of us, for themselves. 80% of the new energy devices they're making are coal plants and gas-fired combined cycle plants for their own economy.
They are selling a lot of electric vehicles, though, it seems. So they're not.
Yeah.
To their own domestic market. Dave, I could talk to you all day, but let me just have a final question because we're at the end of our time. You brought to my attention, I alluded to it a little while ago, but I want to close on it because we're now on notice, as we've talked about throughout the program, that the Chinese Communist Party, our mortal enemy, is taking advantage of, whether they've had a hand in conjuring this up or whether they're just exploiting it, it's another day's work, but they're taking advantage of this opportunity to sell equipment to us, which, at least in some instances, has sensors or kill switches or trapdoors or whatever you want to call them that will enable them, we know this, will enable them to shut them down and possibly destroy them at will. The cumulative effect of which we've had several of our presenters here speak to in the most dire terms. I mean, I think it was Sam Faddis who put it as boldly as saying, you will be returned to the 1600s, the pre-industrial age, and not for a day, not for a week, but for the foreseeable future, as long as you may live. Given all of that, Dave Walsh, how is it that any responsible legislator, and I want to speak specifically to Republicans who we had thought were not actually drinking the Kool-Aid on all of this Green New Deal stuff. In fact, most of them have campaigned as regarding it as folly. And yet, knowing what they know now and insisting that these subsidies must continue, and thereby insisting that there will be more of these kill switches and ticking time bombs inserted into our most critical of critical infrastructures. What are they thinking? And what should they be thinking instead, at the insistence, at the very least, of the people that they are supposed to represent?
Let me point to, we've got 7 senators on the Republican side who have stood up and said they will never vote to dismantle these incentives on solar, wind, and battery storage. 2 of them, for example, are Murkowski and Shelley Moore Capito, unbelievably from West Virginia, the home of natural gas and coal in this country. So those folks, Capito, Murkowski, are specifically supporting the continuance of total energy supply in this country for electricity being China sourced. That's what they're supporting. No idea why, except for the fact that they are undoubtedly major recipients of PAC donations from developers like Nextera and other corporate entities. By the way, most of these incentives go to huge large cap utilities, Constellation, Exxon, ExxonMobil, the like, foreign companies, EDF, British Petroleum, Shell Oil, are the big recipients of these incentives to build out solar farms and wind farms, in many cases greenwashing their installed base and carbon capture systems, ExxonMobil, that wind up funding these folks in the Senate to take these positions that are completely un-American positions, not in the interest of ratepayers, not in the interest of industry here, but in the interest of continuing the China juggernaut of supplying all of the capex and all the equipment for U.S. supplied electrification. It's pathetic, but I think money's at the core of it. PAC donations are at the heart of it. It's certainly the case here in Florida, with the ownership by a company solarizing Florida, Nextera, of the State House, the State Senate, and the governor, and the Public Service Commission, where this has been happening very quietly, with no notoriety from the governor's office whatsoever. His Public Service Commission approving every month a package of new solar farms by Duke Energy, Nextera, and TECO. Just unbelievable in red states, also such as Texas, where this is going on.
It seems to me that a campaign is needed to light these folks up, to make them explain what they are doing. And not least, you just indicated, not only buying this stuff from China with kill switches in it, but also giving the money to foreign contractors to build out some of these things. And just very quickly, David, you have an astounding statistic in terms of the land use implications of a dual cycle natural gas fired turbine plant on the one hand, and one of the solar panel farms that they're building in your native state of Florida. Could you just give us that?
Yeah, just an example. Back in the day, a major successful competitor of mine, Siemens, built a marvelous 1,250 megawatt super advanced combined cycle plant in West Palm Beach City that occupies about 20 acres. 1,250 megawatt, 7 by 24 operating gas-fired power plant. It would take 29,000 acres of solar panels to equal the same capacity. But the trouble would still be that would only operate from 9:30 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon and leave out about 18 hours, 28,000 acres. But that's being reproduced across the state and across the country. Huge, huge, huge land use issue with this, with wind and solar specifically. It's just an unthinkable land use issue.
And it's permanent land use, is that right? It's very difficult.
Well, solar panels wind up shielding sunlight for the whole number of years they're installed, and you wind up with loss of seed matter in the ground, and you're turning arable, farmable land over time into desert that can go on 15 to 20 years post the panels, because you've denuded the seed material in the ground and the nutrients needed to be fertile by the constant shading under these panels. So that this is a huge land destruction issue. At least wind, you can, not good either economically, very intermittent, but you can farm under it. You can't really have any
birds too.
Yeah, but the solar thing is a disaster on turning arable farmland basically into desert.
Yeah, and that doesn't even take into account what you have to do to try to take out those panels and dispose of them.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and then who owns the land at the end of the deal? That's a big, that land ought to be held in trust for citizens, not for utilities who, as an unintended consequence or byproduct of their strategy to make money, also wind up owning 20% of a state's land. That's an unintended consequence.
And destroying it in the process.
And destroying it, yeah.
Dave, I just want to give you one last shot at this because I've mentioned it several times. If you were advising President Trump as to what should be done, given everything we've laid out, you and others have mentioned that he actually took an initiative to try to prevent the further infusion into our grid of Chinese or foreign adversaries' equipment, only to have it reversed by Joe Biden. I want to tell a quick story, if I may, because it's relevant to the answer that I'm asking from you. Back in June of 2015, before Donald Trump announced that he was going to become a candidate for the presidency, coming down the escalator, the whole thing, he responded to an invitation that the Center for Security Policy, which I ran at the time, issued to presidential candidates to come to Iowa, the first primary state, well before, of course, the primary season, but already people were turning up there, as they often do, in the hustings at the state fair and so on. And we wanted them to come and to talk about national security issues, partly, frankly, as a effort to make sure they were thinking about national security issues and had a chance to talk with people who would be very interested in learning what they were going to propose. A guy who was, as I say, not a candidate at the time responded, Donald Trump, and he said he'd like to come and speak, provided he could have an hour to get briefed up by our team at the Center for Security Policy. And one of the most important content items that was relayed to him was this story of the grid. Notably, one of our colleagues, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, was on hand. He had been staffing that committee that I talked about at the very beginning, the commission, I should say, on electromagnetic pulse. And by the time they were done with President Trump, Peter and other members of our team, he was physically shaken by what he'd heard. He was in complete disbelief that as much was known about what was wrong at the time, before a lot of this green nonsense kicked in, with the grid that made it so vulnerable, and the fact that more had not been done to rectify the problem. So much so that he famously said to us, when, not if, when I am president, I'm going to knock heads together and get this done. And I think there was some effort made by him. You mentioned Will Happer was a scientific advisor to him at the time for part of that first presidency. But he hasn't done it. So it hasn't gotten it done, and there's been a lot of slippage since. So once again, if you were briefing the president today and knowing what you do, having said what you've said about the various shortcomings, the various forces at work, and the various additional vulnerabilities we now confront in this most critical, as I say, of critical infrastructures, what would you recommend he do, sir?
About four key things. One, right away, empower NERC through the DOE, empower NERC to call for the cessation of shutting down any baseload power plants over 10 megawatts, unless a NERC region can show cause that power, minute by minute, can be replaced the moment of shutdown immediately. That would stall about 160,000 megawatts worth of plant shutdowns, about 15% of the nation's electricity supply, scheduled to be closed in the next 2 to 3 years. Stop doing that, because we don't have technology that can displace that power anywhere near to replace it. Coal, gas, and then a few more nuclear plants scheduled to be closed. Stop closing them. Mandate discontinuing shuttering plants. The second thing,
and excuse me, just one quick question. And your assessment is that most of those plants have additional life that could be maintained in working condition?
Yeah, all this technology Dick talked about can be modernized, upgraded. Coal plants were built really to last 80, 90 years, not 30 or 40. The same with combined cycle plants. They can last indefinitely, 60, 70 years. Nuclear plants, 60, 70 years. As long as the primary components keep up with their maintenance schedules and are replaced and modernized, these plants can last a very, very long time. There is no reason to be closing them to displace them with 4 or 5 hour a day stuff. That's lunacy. Yes. So you got that, but also getting in the way of the incentives, incentivizing the Chinaization of our electrical system, because that's who makes the equipment, the solar, the inverters, the battery storage. Get in the way of that, get the tariffs back to where they were, and then even look at some of the great foreign investment that he has done a masterful job of inducing to the country now in trillions of dollars. Talk to the Saudis, the UAE, and the Japanese about, in part, investing in large-scale coal and gas plants on federal DOE sites that are huge. The Savannah River Project, the Waste Isolation Pilot Project out west, on the site of TVA. You can support MISO and PJM, who have huge electrical shortages broadcast by those grids underway now. Put plants in the TVA western region and in the eastern region, put them to West Virginia, bring foreign capital. Since U.S. capital doesn't seem to be interested, based on these artificial markets in investing in baseload power, bring the foreign money to do it. This has been done before in the gas turbine boom of 20 years ago. And in Southern Company, Bobby Jones himself, in his attorney capacity, polled Europe. Northern investors weren't willing to invest in the electrification of the South in the 100 years following the Civil War. Bobby Jones went to get money from Europe to do that for Southern Company in lending space. So this has been done before. Let's bring the foreign investment to bear on, in part, to building out rapidly as we can on federal lands, basic base load power plants that the country desperately needs. And then maybe we can induce our own private sector into getting in the game to compete with that and do the same thing. Because we've got a huge crisis in front of us right now. This isn't something that we can wait for the invention of small modular reactors 15 years from now to solve. This problem is here with us today. PJM and MISO grid management leadership have been very out there. This issue is in front of us next year, especially in PJM, with recurring shortages occurring in PJM, which is New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Ohio, West Virginia. It's a huge region. MISO, a huge region. Same issues going on there. I mean, this is a serious crisis before us. It demands pretty dramatic solutions.
Last thought. There are these subsidies that are currently misdirected. Is it possible, I guess this would take statutory revision, not just executive leadership, but is it possible that those subsidies could simply be applied to subsidizing baseload power production instead?
Well, with the picture I just painted, I don't think needs to be a subsidized one. I wasn't talking about subsidizing foreign investment in building combined cycle baseload plants. I was simply talking about inducing them to come and bid in to the grids in shortage to do it, and they'll find there's profitability in that. Right. But the other stuff, I think by presidential fiat, with the budget crisis, the $2 trillion a year, and now the S&P downgrade, for heaven's sake, the gun is loaded with the reasons to get this budget under control, and spending $80 billion a year incentivizing part-time power devices is among one of the most lunatic actions of the prior administration that needs dismantled. If he's liable to be tarred with, these are his policies. If he continues to talk about this is one big beautiful bill and these things remain, he's going to have a very hard time in credibility space removing these incentives. Yeah. So we've got to push this to happen. We've got to dismantle these. They're destroying us, and they're creating zero value, yeah. Negative value.
And I guess the kicker is that that's happening before the Chinese even take action to pull the plug on us. And
exactly.
That is yet another set of considerations, as we've been talking about throughout the program.
Yes, sir. Strategy 101, non-kinetic warfare that they're great at. Yes.
Yeah. Dave Walsh, let me just say, you're the last man standing. Thank you for sticking around and taking all these questions and doing so, as always, so handsomely. I want to thank, of course, you, as well as Dick Storm and our friend Sam Faddis, as well as Colonel Grant Newsom, for an extraordinarily informative program. The commentaries and questions that we're getting from our audience online here are, I think, can be summed up in one word: gobsmacked. And it's not to suggest that the smart people who are in this audience haven't heard some of this before, but I think the cumulative effect of this, properly so, is to just cause incredulity, but also we hope, and the reason for this program, as the reason is really for all of these webinars, is to equip each of you to act. We're not about admiring this problem. We need action. You have just given us, Dave, 4 very actionable steps that need to be taken now. I personally believe, based on what we experienced firsthand with Donald Trump back in 2015, 10 years ago, that he gets this. He's a builder, after all. He understands utilities and electricity and the like, and he knows how vital it is to the future of our country that it not be interrupted by enemies, foreign or domestic. With that, again, thank you to all of you for listening. I pray, as always, that you will find opportunities, at the very minimum, to share this video when our wonderful colleague Oleg Atbashian completes its production in the very near future. And I will turn it, with that and my thanks, back to Didi Laugesen. Over to you, Majid.
Thank you, Frank. And thanks for being here today. A video of this webinar will be posted at presentdangerchina.org, generally within a day of our program's conclusion. Please share this, as Frank said, and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. For webinar notices, updates, and news, subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPD China. Join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how the CCP captured elites betray the USA. Thanks for joining us today. Goodbye. Bye.